The branch smelled faintly of ink and carpet cleaner the way all banks do. I had come in expecting a small clerical issue, something simple, maybe a missing signature or a renewal notice. The young clerk behind the desk stood as soon as he saw me. His name tag read Kyle. He couldn't have been older than 30, and his hands fidgeted with a pen he clearly didn't need. "Mrs. Marks," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming in. I think it's best if you sit down." The tone made me pause. I sat. He hesitated, then slid a thin folder across the desk. "Your son came in last week. He tried to close your account." I didn't speak. The words didn't seem to belong in the room, not between the quiet hum of printers and the steady click of keyboards. Kyle continued, his face pale. He presented a power of attorney form. It listed your late husband as co-signer. We found inconsistencies. I opened the folder. There it was, my name in clean black type, followed by a shaky, imitated version of my signature. My husband's name, Richard Marks, printed below in a hand that wasn't his, and a doctor's note attached at the end, neatly worded, stating that I was suffering from early-stage cognitive decline. The notary stamp was blurred, the ink heavy, as if pressed by an impatient hand. I traced the edge of the page with my thumb and felt the smallest tremor. Daniel's handwriting sat at the bottom, looping, and rushed the same hand that once wrote me birthday cards in crayon. I looked at Kyle. "What do I need to sign to remove his access?" He blinked. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "Revoke every authorization. Permanently." He nodded and reached for the forms. I took the pen, my hand steadier than I expected, and began to sign. Each line was a boundary being drawn, each initial a door closing. The world didn't explode. It just narrowed into a quiet, deliberate stillness. How does a mother keep breathing when the betrayal carries her own last name? I set my handbag on the counter and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The house was too still, like it was waiting for me to speak first. I didn't. Instead, I walked to the study, knelt by the old safe my husband had built 40 years ago, and spun the dial with the same motion I'd used 1,000 times before. The hinges creaked as it opened. Inside sat the archive of our life together. Bills paid on time, deeds, receipts, canceled checks, and insurance forms so old the paper had gone soft at the edges. I ran my fingers over the stacks, the neat handwriting on every envelope. Proof that we had done everything right, that I had kept our world in order. I pulled out a folder and laid it open on the desk. My name was everywhere, flowing across documents like a pattern I could trace in my sleep. Richard's too strong, angled, precise. Then beside them in my memory, the imitation from the bank, the careless loop Daniel had used when pretending to be me. I stared at the difference. The one line that separated truth from betrayal. My hand trembled, once a brief flicker of weakness, and then went still. I had balanced accounts for decades. I could balance this one too. I remembered the day Daniel was 10, sitting at the kitchen table with a blue pen, grinning. He'd copied my signature perfectly on a permission slip for a field trip I hadn't yet signed. I'd laughed and told him he had his mother's handwriting. He'd beamed proud of the mimicry. Now that same hand had learned a darker lesson, the art of pretending I didn't exist. The thought burned slowly, like paper curling under a steady flame. I closed the folder and placed it back into the safe, the metal door shutting with a final click. How many lessons turn into weapons when love forgets where it came from? The kitchen table had always been my place for balancing things, bills, grocery lists, the small math of everyday life. That afternoon, it became something else. I carried the old folders from the safe and spread them across the worn surface, sorting them by year, by purpose, by memory. The first check was easy to remember. $50 for Daniel's baseball uniform. He'd come home with grass stains and a grin holding that jersey like it meant the world. The next came a few years later, a deposit for his first apartment when he said he wanted space to grow. Then tuition payments, car repairs, wedding expenses, the down payment on the house he and Evelyn swore they'd pay back once they got settled. Decades of numbers lined the paper like rings in a tree trunk, each one marking another season of giving. I never thought of it as loss. I thought it was love, the kind that doesn't keep score. But as I laid out statement after statement, I realized my life hadn't been measured in birthdays or holidays. It had been counted out in withdrawals. Every signature was an act of faith, a quiet declaration that my son would never take more than I could give. Yet here I was, tallying 41 checks, each one written in hope that he'd see me, appreciate me, remember me. The total wasn't just numbers, it was a story told in ink and trust. My stomach twisted when I added it all up, not because of what was gone, but because of how long it took me to see the pattern. Somewhere between the first baseball uniform and the last emergency transfer, the giving had turned into something else. Obligation disguised as love, dependence dressed as devotion. I stacked the papers neatly, pressing my palm against the pile as if I could feel the years inside it. When did generosity become permission to be erased? The phone rang just as I was stacking the last of the old bank statements. Daniel's name lit up the screen in calm, familiar letters. Letters I used to associate with comfort. I hesitated, then answered. "Hey, Mom," he said too casually, that easy charm he used when he wanted something. "Listen, if the bank calls, don't panic. It's just paperwork routine stuff." Routine. The word sat heavy in my chest. He kept talking, voice bright, confident, rehearsed. Something about legal processes, about simplifying things for when you're ready to slow down. I listened the way one listens to a song they've heard too many times, aware of the tune, numb to the meaning. He slipped in phrases like, "just looking out for you, and we'll sort it all soon." I imagined him sitting at his desk, one hand on the phone, the other flipping through papers that didn't belong to him. I let him talk until the words blurred, until the sound of his voice became nothing but static. When he finally stopped, I said only, "Of course," and hung up. The silence afterward was deeper than quiet. It was clarity. I sat at the table surrounded by years of proof, each document whispering the same truth. He'd been rehearsing this routine for a long time. I reached for the phone again and scrolled past his name, past the neighbors, until I found the number I hadn't dialed since Richard's funeral. Carla Benton, the voice on the other end, said after 2 rings. "Carla?" I replied, surprised by how steady I sounded. "I need to change my will." There was no tremor in my tone, no hesitation. Just a clean, simple decision, like balancing a ledger that had been uneven for years. When I ended the call, I closed the folder on the table. For the first time in months, it felt like something had been settled. What kind of love calls theft routine? Carla's office was the kind of place where nothing ever felt out of place. The smell of ink and paper filled the air, steady, professional, comforting in its structure. She listened as I spoke, the soft click of her pen, the only sound between my sentences. I told her everything. The forged documents, the phone call, the word routine, spoken like it meant mercy instead of betrayal. My voice didn't tremble. I wasn't asking for pity or outrage. I just wanted things corrected. When I finished, Carla sat back in her chair, studying me with that quiet intelligence she'd always had. "Do you want to press charges?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "Some lessons have to end in silence." She nodded, then slid a stack of forms across the desk. Together we went line by line. I removed Daniel's name from the will, each stroke of my pen cutting through years of forgiveness I hadn't even realized I'd been handing out. In his place, I added a trust for Sophie, my granddaughter, the only one who still came by with no expectations, no pretense. For Sophie Marks, I wrote because she visits without wanting anything. Carla looked up briefly. You're certain I've never been more certain, I said. The pen felt heavier than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of choice. I signed at the bottom, my handwriting as deliberate as a closing door. The sound of the paper sliding across the polished desk was almost final enough to echo. Carla gathered the pages, aligning them perfectly before setting them aside for certification. You've taken the first step, she said. I smiled faintly. No, I've just stopped walking backward. When I left her office, the afternoon air outside felt sharper, cleaner. I stood on the curb for a moment, breathing in the difference between control and freedom. That signature so often used to give had finally taken something back. When forgiveness becomes a habit, does justice ever get a turn? That evening, I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once written birthday cards and grocery lists. The folder from Carla's office rested beside me, its edges still warm from my hands. The silence of the house felt different, now less hollow, more deliberate. I pulled my old notebook from the drawer, the one Richard used to tease me about for keeping every little thing in order. Its pages were yellowed, but clean, each line ready to hold something final. I drew 2 columns across the first blank page and wrote at the top what I gave and what he took. The pen moved slowly at first, then faster. College tuition, wedding expenses, home loan down payment, emergency bridge loan, second chance after the first lie, third chance after the second. Each word felt like a confession and a release all at once. The list stretched longer than I expected. Years of generosity written in neat, measured lines. When I finished, I added the totals in the margin, $418 to $600. I looked at the number for a long time, not with anger, but with a strange kind of clarity. Then beneath it, I wrote a single word, enough. It didn't look dramatic, just small and final. A declaration made in pen, not in shouting. I closed the notebook and walked to the safe. The combination clicked under my fingers, the same rhythm I'd used for decades to guard what mattered. Inside, I placed the book on top of the deeds and insurance files, then shut the door with a steady hand. Tomorrow, I would go back to the bank. Tomorrow, I'd ask them to strike Daniel Marks from every authorization, every file, every trace of my accounts. For the first time in years, I felt like the numbers were starting to add up again. How many endings begin with one word written in pen? The branch looked exactly as it had a week ago. Polished counters, soft music, the faint hum of the copy machine. But something in the air had shifted. Or maybe it was me. Kyle, the young clerk, spotted me the moment I stepped through the door. His expression flickered between caution and relief. "Mrs. Marks," he said, standing a little straighter this time, "we've prepared the paperwork you requested." There was a trace of respect in his tone, now the kind people reserve for someone who's been underestimated once and won't let it happen twice. He led me to the same seat by the window. The folder waiting on the desk was thicker than before. Forms to revoke Daniel's access, notarize new authorizations, and flag my account for identity protection. "This will make your profile private," Kyle explained. "Only you can make changes from now on. No third-party requests, not even family." "Good," I said. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady, deliberate, the ink moving across the pages like closure made visible. Signature after signature, I reclaimed what should never have been borrowed. When I reached the last line, I paused, looked up, and met his uncertain eyes. "I'm not the confused one," I said quietly. He nodded, once the kind of nod that meant he understood more than policy allowed him to say. When it was done, he handed me a folder stamped "Confirmation of Account Restoration." The words looked bureaucratic, but I could feel their weight, a name preserved, an identity intact. Outside, the sunlight hit harder than I expected, sharp and golden against the cold. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the warmth seep through the glass. In the silence, I could almost hear Richard's voice, the one that used to guide me through the tangle of receipts and ledgers. Never let anyone else balance your books. Eve. This time I listened. What does freedom look like when it comes printed on bank letterhead? He didn't call first. Just showed up. 2 days after the bank visit, I looked up from the kitchen window and saw his car in the driveway. Too new, too polished for someone who still claimed to be struggling. I didn't move. A few seconds later, the knock came sharp. Practice the kind meant to sound casual. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there with a smile he must have rehearsed in the rearview mirror. "Mom," he said lightly, "we need to talk." I stepped aside just enough for him to enter. He didn't thank me. I heard from the bank he started pacing the living room like he owned the air. "You didn't need to make a big deal out of this. I was protecting your assets. I thought you'd appreciate that." My voice stayed calm. "You forged my name." He gave a small, dismissive shrug. "You weren't using half of it anyway." That one sentence hit harder than any shout could. The words settled like dust, quiet, undeniable. I stood near the doorway. Hands, steady eyes fixed on the man I'd once carried through. "Fevers, heartbreaks, and debt. I've protected you long enough," I said evenly. "Now I'm protecting myself." He laughed under his breath, a sound more habit than humor. "You can't just cut me out. I'm your son." I walked to the front door, wrapped my hand around the knob, and pulled it open. "Watch me." For a second, his mask slipped, confusion, pride, maybe fear, but then he gathered himself, muttered something about family and regret, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that felt earned. Through the window, I watched him drive away, one hand gripping the wheel, the other gesturing at nothing. He didn't look back. I leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. The house felt lighter, emptier, but not lonely. When love becomes entitlement, who owes who an apology? Sophie arrived just after sunset, her small car pulling into the driveway without headlights. I could tell by the way she sat for a moment before getting out that she already knew something was wrong. When she stepped inside, she was holding a paper bag of groceries, bread, apples, tea, and wearing that quiet expression of hers that always reminded me of her grandfather. "I heard Dad's upset," she said carefully as she unpacked the bag. "He told people you're confused." I poured water into the kettle and let the steam fill the silence. "He's the one confused," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. We sat at the table, 2 cups between us, the scent of chamomile settling the air. I told her everything, how Daniel forged my signature, how he tried to close my account, how he called it routine. I spoke slowly, not to soften the story, but to let the truth land where it needed to. Sophie didn't interrupt, not once. When I finished, she didn't look shocked, only sad in that quiet, knowing way. People look when something they've always suspected is finally confirmed. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Then I'm proud of you," she said simply. For a moment I couldn't speak. Pride wasn't something I'd expected from anyone in this family for a long time. It came like sunlight through old curtains, soft but real. I smiled, faintly. "You'll get a letter soon," I said. "Read it carefully." She nodded. No questions. No hesitation. "I will." We sat there a little longer, sipping tea that had already gone lukewarm, talking about nothing important. Her work, her classes, the neighbor's cat that kept stealing laundry off her balcony. Ordinary things wrapped in the extraordinary calm of mutual understanding. When she left, the house didn't feel empty. It felt settled, as if some small part of what had been broken had finally found its balance again. Can truth skip a generation and still find its way home? The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, thin and unassuming my name, written in the handwriting I'd known since the first time Daniel spelled it on a crayon-drawn Mother's Day card. There was no return address, but I didn't need one. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully, as though the paper might burn. His words were neat, polite, practiced. "I'm sorry for everything, Mom." I was under pressure. I only wanted to make things easier. Easier. The word lingered like smoke. He apologized for miscommunication for crossed intentions, but never once for the act itself. He wrote about how families drift, how love gets complicated, how stress makes people do things they regret. Every sentence curved away from truth, landing somewhere softer, safer for him. I read it twice. Then I tore it in half. Then again, until it was nothing but paper dust on my table, a quiet snowfall of everything I'd already decided to leave behind. That same afternoon, the mail brought a second envelope, this one from the bank. The letter inside was formal and final. All authorizations revoked, the trust confirmed assets, secured records, updated. Every document carried one thing that mattered: my signature, written in the same steady hand that had once signed his report cards and rent checks. I placed the letter beside my teacup and reached for my notebook. On a fresh page, I wrote slowly, letting each word stand on its own line. My name, my account, my peace. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, scattering the last of the autumn leaves across the yard. I watched them drift and settle, no longer trying to hold on to what had already let go. For the first time in years, the silence felt like ownership, not absence. If a woman signs her freedom in ink, does that make it revenge or remembrance? And when a name survives, the ones who tried to steal it, isn't that enough?